Mitsue stared out the window at the hills rolling past relentlessly. He talked about something you'd done, something he'd heard about. She paused as if expecting him to speak. When he didn't, she continued. Of course, if it's something you'd rather not talk about, I understand. Mitsue closed his eyes. He wanted to tell her the truth, every detail so that she wouldn't misunderstand. He wanted to tell her how the Noctura swept up through the trapdoor, how the terror piled on his heart. He wanted her to feel how the whole world shrank and tilted, all his thoughts and feelings, all the jumbled mess of his life sliding out into the dark, till there was only the one thing, the point, the singularity, the desire, the desperation, one more breath, one more moment, how that was all he wanted. He'd make her understand that if he could, how his brain railed against the inside of his head till it felt like his skull would burst and the gray matter shower the walls. He wanted to tell her. He wanted her to know that in that moment it wasn't courage that made him act. It wasn't love. In that moment those things couldn't even exist. Cowardice. That's all it was. In that moment he unhinged. He opened up to the very core, and he discovered that he was empty but for that. Empty. A coward. And so he seized that awful power. He set it loose. He killed his best friend. His sister. He did it to save himself. That was all of it. That was the truth. He slid down the glass. Feeling the tears well up, he squeezed his eyes shut, pressed them back. He wanted to tell her everything, but he couldn't, because telling her would make it real again. He'd be there once more, stuck in the grit of it, bound to watch it unfold, slowly, unable to change anything. Liar. The thought passed like wind in the night. He wiped his tired eyes and watched the hills unfold, one into the next, the directionless wilds flinging past the window. No, that wasn't it. The truth was he couldn't tell her because he was afraid that when he finished, when the words had all run out, when she finally understood him, he'd look at her and he'd see it glowing in her eyes, crystalline, limning her irises. Pity. And that would be more than he could bear. The floorboards groaned as she crossed to him, and he felt her hand on his back. I'm sorry, she said. Forget I asked. Some things are hard to talk about. He wanted to thank her, but there didn't seem to be any words, so he simply nodded. She yawned. I'm exhausted. She stretched her hands over her head. Still, there's no way I could sleep. Every time I blink, I see it crawling towards me. She dropped her arms to her sides and looked out the window. They crossed a bridge beneath which a wide river tumbled down through the hills. It's beautiful here. Mitsue nodded. He cracked his lids and looked out the window, and it seemed for a moment that the past was speeding towards him. They were moving not through space, but time. The train would stop and he'd get off. 6 years old. His mother would be there to greet him. She'd hold him tight, press his face into the folds of her kimono. He'd breathe the smell of plums, and she'd whisper his name. But then he moved his head and the past broke open, and he saw only the mountains and the valleys again. Nothing more. He stepped away from the window, unable to bear it any longer. I guess it doesn't matter. We'll be there soon enough, Olivia said. Then with a gasp, maybe sooner than I thought. Mitsue, look! The train rounded the edge of a mountain, and suddenly, there it was, an enormous lake in the shape of a crane taking flight, plumage white beneath the phosphorescent moon. Tsuruko, and all along its rim to the edges of sight, the city, scattered about like a child's toy blocks, a mosaic of color set between the toes of the jet-black hills. Sotsu. Docks, homes, shops, restaurants, lives, too many to count. Mitsue's eyes skimmed the cityscape, from Asakose in the north to Otantsu in the east, all the little lights glittering like chains of gold, moonlight draining along the streets and out into the egg-white lake. 1,000 nebulous emotions warred in his chest. 1,000 half-shaped thoughts boiled in his brain. But then the clouds settled in his soul, and the falling rain rinsed all his feelings away, left him clean, left him barren, left him numb. The only residual sensation a clinging disappointment, and that too dispersed. He had thought seeing Sotsu would bring it all back, the life he'd lived there, that the sweet would feel sweeter, and maybe the bitter would cut more deeply too, but that was also part of it. Memory would become life, slip off its dark coil and walk about in the broad daylight. He was prepared for that, prepared to feel something, anything. But not this. I don't even recognize it. He looked along the downtown, the dour brick buildings, the trembling headlights of the automobiles, the cobblestone roads, and he remembered how it used to be, how Ginmizu Temple used to look bathed in the morning moonlight. It was all different, even the parts that seemed the same. The order, grid-like roads, the square homes and shops set at even intervals. Gone, changed. Wooden buildings backing onto one another, crowding for space. Some charred and blackened and collapsed into the road, cannibalized for parts, stripped down to the dirt. Spiderweb streets cutting crooked through the mess. A city only partially rebuilt. The festering burns still open to the air. The smiling specter of what had happened 9 years before looming over all, now taking the form of a bone-white tower standing astride the hills, its long shadow eclipsing the city. Without needing to be told, Mitsue knew that was where they were heading. Knew that was Ignis, bone-white and spiny, a tower of thorns erupting out of the dirt, a fire blazing at its zenith, and the dread squeezed into his veins, pumped along with his heart, life and anxiety in each beat. He'd seen enough. He slumped back into his seat and covered his eyes with his arm. "Olivia," he said. "Yeah? Wake me up when we get to the station, will you?" "Yeah."